High in the frozen mountains of Montana, a cowboy chose to live where winter never forgives. He believed silence was safer than hope, until a woman rode through the snow asking not for love, but for survival. Their marriage was signed without vows, without promises. And then the mountain turned against them. Snow buried the truth. Powerful men circled like wolves, and everything they were trying to protect stood on the edge of being lost. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Silver Creek, Montana, sat tucked into the ribs of the northern Rockies like a settlement the world had forgotten on purpose. In summer, it was a handful of wooden buildings and smoke-thin trails, a creek that ran clear enough to shame a mirror, and a sky so big it made men talk softer. In winter, it became something else entirely, an endurance test shaped like a town. Snow arrived early and stayed late, piling against doors until they opened inward, sealing wagon ruts into hard white scars, swallowing fences, silencing everything except the wind. That January morning, the air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, and the sun rose pale and distant, as if it didn't want to get involved. The mountains around Silver Creek wore ice-like armor. The pine trees stood rigid and black-green, their branches bowed under weight. Down in town, chimneys breathed thin ribbons of smoke. Up on the ridge above it all, past the last clustered cabins, past the frozen creek bend, past the line where most men stopped and turned back. Elias Boone Calder lived where the snow line began to feel personal. His ranch was not large, not prosperous, not the sort of place anyone would visit for comfort. It was a stubborn patch of land that survived mostly because its owner refused to admit defeat. The house was a squat timber structure with a steep roof built to shed snow and a porch that creaked like an old man's knees. The barn leaned slightly in the wind, patched in places with mismatched boards, and the corral fence was a rough circle of split logs that had been repaired more times than replaced. Everything up there looked as though it had been built with the understanding that beauty was optional, but survival was not. Elias himself looked like the kind of man the mountains produced when they were feeling strict. He was 34, tall without being broad, his build lean and corded, shaped by hauling feed sacks and splitting wood rather than vanity. His face was angular, high, cheekbones, a straight nose slightly crooked from a break that had healed without a doctor, and a jaw darkened by rough stubble that never quite became a full beard in winter because he was too busy to care. His hair was dark brown, cut short with a knife when it got in his eyes, and his skin held the weather's evidence: windburn on the cheeks, sun-darkened lines where his hat brim ended, and the faint pale scar running along his left forearm from a barbed wire tear years ago. His eyes were a muted hazel, green threaded with brown, steady, watchful, and difficult to read. People in town said he had the mountain stare, the kind that looked past conversation and measured whether you were worth the trouble. It wasn't cruelty. It was caution turned into habit. Elias had learned early that the wrong kind of friendliness invited the wrong kind of need, and need was heavy in a place where winter didn't negotiate. He had not always been this quiet. Once, there had been laughter. In him, easy and unguarded, like a man who believed tomorrow was guaranteed. That version of Elias belonged to the years when his younger brother Owen still lived. Owen had been 21 when he died, bright-eyed, strong, always moving too fast as if the world might run out before he could see it all. He had loved the ranch, loved the horses, loved the way a good herd moved like water when guided right. He also believed in proving himself, the way young men do. The winter Owen died, the supply route from town to the ridge iced over after an early storm. Feed was low, the road was worse. Elias had told Owen to wait. Owen had gone anyway, arguing that he could handle a short run down to Silver Creek and back. A few hours later, the mountain shifted. A slab of snow broke loose above the pass and came down like a white wall, swallowing the trail. Owen's body wasn't found until spring. Elias had dug for him with hands that bled through leather gloves, searching until there was nothing left to search but guilt. After that, Elias stopped coming down to town unless he had to. He stopped sitting in the back of the saloon where people talked over whiskey and pretended winter was a story that happened to other men. He stayed above the snow line because, in his mind, leaving felt like letting the mountain win twice. On that morning, he was up before daylight, moving through his routine as if routine itself could keep tragedy away. He broke ice in the water trough with the blunt end of an axe, the sound ringing sharp in the frozen air. He fed the horses first, because horses remembered kindness and repaid it with steadiness. Then he checked the cattle. Only a small herd wintered up there. The rest moved down to lower pasture in fall. The ones that remained were tough and slow-moving, their breath steaming white, coats thick. His gloves were stiff from frost. His boots crunched on snow packed hard as stone. The wind pressed against him, constant and indifferent. In the corral stood Ash, the horse Elias trusted more than any person in Silver Creek. Ash was an old gelding, at least 14, with a coat the color of storm clouds and a pale muzzle that made him look permanently dusted with flour. He had one ear that bent slightly at the tip from an old injury, and his eyes were calm, dark, and intelligent. Ash had survived blizzards that killed younger animals, and had once pulled Elias out of a whiteout by following the faint scent of home when Elias could not see 5 feet ahead. Elias ran a hand along Ash's neck as he poured feed into the trough. "You and me, old man," he murmured, voice rough from cold. Ash flicked an ear and leaned into the touch as if accepting the promise. The ranch dog appeared next, emerging from beneath the porch like a small shadow. His name was Bramble, a shaggy shepherd mix with a coat the color of dried grass and snowmelt mud. Bramble was 9 years old and moved with the careful stiffness of a dog whose joints ached in winter. One eye had a cloudy film, age or an old injury, so he turned his head slightly when he looked at things, but his hearing was sharp and his loyalty sharper. He trotted after Elias, tail wagging low, not playful, just present. Bramble had been Owen's dog once. After Owen died, Bramble followed Elias as if the two of them were all that was left of a pack the mountain had broken. Elias finished his morning checks and returned to the house to stoke the stove. The interior was spare. A heavy table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with jars of preserved vegetables, a few hooks for coats, and a small framed photograph on the wall. The Calder brothers standing in front of the barn years earlier, faces sunlit and smiling, Owen's arm thrown around Elias's shoulders. Elias rarely looked at the photograph directly. He kept it there for the same reason he kept the ranch, because some things were too painful to lose again, even if keeping them hurt. He was pouring coffee, thick, dark, more bitter than pleasant, when he heard the sound that made his hand pause mid-pour. Bells, faint at first, carried by wind, then clearer, the jingle of harness bells and the creak of wood under strain. No one came up to the ridge in January without a reason worth freezing for. Elias set the pot down and moved to the window, pushing the curtain aside. A sleigh was climbing the approach, pulled by 2 broad-chested draft horses with frost on their eyelashes. The driver sat hunched in a heavy coat, reins tight, head down against the wind. And beside him, clutching the edge of the bench with gloved hands, sat an older man Elias recognized even before the sleigh reached the gate. Reverend Thomas Sutter was the town's pastor, a man in his late 50s with a long gray beard and a face weathered by both prayer and hard Montana winters. He wasn't the kind of preacher who spoke like he was auditioning for heaven. He was practical, sturdy, the sort who helped dig graves. When the ground was too frozen for hired hands, he climbed down slowly, boots sinking into the snow, and gave Elias a nod that carried both greeting and warning. "Elias," he called, voice hoarse from cold. "Morning." Elias stepped onto the porch, coat pulled tight, eyes narrowed against the wind. "Reverend," he replied, "what are you doing up here?" Sutter didn't answer immediately. He turned and helped the other passenger down from the sleigh, careful the way one was careful with fragile things. The woman who stepped onto Elias's land looked like she had been carved out of determination and exhaustion. She was around 29, slender but not delicate, wrapped in a dark wool coat that had once been fine but now showed travel wear along the hem. Her skirt was long and practical, her boots sturdy, scuffed by snow and distance. A few strands of auburn hair had escaped from beneath her knitted cap, curling against her cheeks. Her skin was pale from winter, and strain, with a faint flush at the nose from cold. Her eyes were a steady gray blue, focused, alert, and tired in a way that suggested she hadn't slept properly in weeks. She carried a leather satchel slung across her body, held tight as if it contained the last pieces of her life. She looked at Elias with the kind of attention reserved for men who might say yes or no and mean it. "This is Margaret Hale," Reverend Sutter said. "Most folks call her Mara." Elias watched her hands, gloved but tense, fingers curled. He watched her posture, straight but braced. He watched the way she scanned the yard like someone already measuring escape routes. "What's this?" Elias asked, voice flat. Mara swallowed once, then stepped forward, boots crunching on snow. Her breath came out in small clouds. "Mr. Calder," she said, voice steady despite the cold, "I'm sorry to arrive like this." She paused, as if choosing words that would not break under weight. "But I was told you don't scare easily, and I need someone who won't." Elias didn't move. Bramble stood at his heel, ears forward. Ash lifted his head in the corral, watching. The mountain wind pressed against them all, impatient. Reverend Sutter's eyes held quiet urgency. Mara's gaze didn't waver, and though she had not yet said the impossible sentence, Elias felt it coming the way he felt storms, in the shift of air, in the tightening of the world before impact. "Come inside," Elias said finally, not as kindness, but as necessity. "If you've climbed this far, you've earned warmth long enough to explain why." Mara nodded once, relief flickering briefly across her face before discipline reclaimed it. The Reverend guided her toward the porch. The sleigh horses snorted, steam rising from their nostrils. Snow fell in fine, dry grains that didn't melt when they touched skin. As Elias held the door open, he had the unshakable sense that winter had brought him more than cold. This time, it had brought him a turning point, wrapped in wool and urgency, stepping across his threshold with the weight of a story that would not leave quietly. The house took a long moment to accept new bodies. Heat from the iron stove pushed back against the cold in slow waves, and the smell of burning pine settled into the air, sharp but comforting. Snow fell steadily outside, tapping against the window panes like impatient fingers, while inside the room grew quieter, smaller, as if it were drawing a breath to listen. Elias closed the door behind them and slid the wooden bolt into place, not out of fear, but habit. Winter had taught him that open things invited trouble. The woman, Mara, stood near the table, hands still gloved, posture straight despite the stiffness in her shoulders. Up close, Elias could see the fine cracks in her composure, the faint tremor in her fingers when she loosened her scarf, the shadow beneath her eyes that no amount of resolve could hide. Her auburn hair, darker indoors, was pinned back with care, though a few strands escaped and curled from dampness. Her face was narrow, cheekbones pronounced, lips pale, from cold, and there was a quiet intelligence in the way her eyes moved, observing, cataloging, adjusting. Reverend Sutter stamped snow from his boots and moved closer to the stove, rubbing his hands together. He was a broad man, shoulders rounded from years of labor as much as prayer, his beard threaded thick with gray. His eyes carried the weary steadiness of someone who had buried too many people too young and married too few under joyful circumstances. Elias poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and set one in front of Mara, then one near the Reverend. He did not sit. He leaned against the counter instead, arms folded, his presence like a brace holding the room together. Bramble settled near the stove, lowering himself carefully with a grunt, cloudy eye half closed, the other watching Mara without hostility. Ash's shape moved past the window, a dark blur against white, patient even in cold. "You've got 10 minutes before the coffee cools," Elias said. "Use them," Mara wrapped her hands around the mug, not drinking yet, letting the heat seep into her palms. When she spoke, her voice was low but clear, carrying the cadence of someone used to being listened to without raising volume. She explained where she had come from, not just geographically, but morally. Silver Creek's orphan home sat at the edge of town, a squat building with a sagging roof and a bell that rang too loud in quiet hours. It had been run by her aunt for nearly 2 decades, supported by church funds, small donations, and stubborn hope. When her aunt died the previous spring, the responsibility fell to Mara as next of kin. She had left a teaching position in Helena to take it on, believing care was something you stepped into even when it cost you. What she hadn't known, what no one had mentioned until paperwork arrived, was the clause tied to the deed. The home had been placed in trust, and the trust required a married overseer to retain control. The clause was old, written by men who believed unmarried women were temporary caretakers, not anchors. Without a husband by the coming spring thaw, the property would revert to county control, And the children would be redistributed. Some would go to relatives. Most would be sent east. Elias listened without interruption, his face unreadable, eyes fixed on the grain of the table. Reverend Sutter added what Mara did not say. The county had already received inquiries from a land syndicate interested in purchasing the property once it reverted, turning it into storage for logging operations. They see empty land, Sutter said, not small hands that need holding. Mara finally lifted the mug and drank, wincing slightly at the bitterness. I tried to fight it through letters, she continued, appeals, meetings. I was told the law was the law. She met Elias's gaze directly now. Someone in town said you were a man who didn't care much for the law when it forgot people. Elias's jaw tightened. Someone in town talks too much. Probably, Mara said. But they were right about one thing. You're not easily moved. Silence stretched. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the eaves. Elias thought of Owen, of paperwork signed by men who had never stood in the snow above the ridge, of how easy it was for systems to crush the inconvenient. Why me? He asked finally, voice flat. Why not one of the men in town? Mara's mouth tightened, not in anger but in truth. Because they would want something I can't give, or they'd fold the moment pressure came, and because you live above the line where most people stop caring what others think. Sutter shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable but not disagreeing. Elias pushed off the counter and moved to the window, staring out at the white sweep of land. He did not answer immediately. He measured the weight of another person's need against the quiet he had built like a wall. He thought of Owen again, of the way his brother had believed helping was worth risk. Marriage, Elias said slowly, turning back, isn't shelter. It's a door that doesn't close easily. Mara nodded. I know. If I agree, he continued, there are conditions. She straightened, ready. Say them. No lies, he said. Not to the town, not to the children. If this is a legal thing, we call it that. Second, this ranch stays what it is. I don't turn it into a symbol. Agreed. Third, Elias added, you don't step into this thinking I'll save you. I won't. I'll stand with you if I choose to. That's different. Mara's eyes softened, just a fraction. That's all I'm asking. The Reverend cleared his throat. The weather, he said, glancing toward the window, is turning. I should head back before the pass seals. Elias nodded and fetched his coat. Outside, the sleigh horses stamped, impatient. Sutter paused at the door, looking between them. Sometimes, he said gently, God doesn't answer prayers by removing hardship. Sometimes he sends someone who knows how to endure it. Then he was gone, bells fading into the wind. The house felt larger and smaller at once with his absence. Mara stood alone near the table, coat still on, as if unsure whether she had permission to stay. Elias gestured toward the spare room down the short hallway. You'll take that, he said. Storm's coming. You're not riding back tonight. Relief flickered across her face, quickly masked. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he replied. Morning decides things clearer than night. As she moved down the hall, Bramble followed a few steps, then looked back at Elias, tail wagging once. Tentative approval offered like a truce. Elias remained by the window long after Mara disappeared from sight, watching snow erase tracks, listening to the wind gather strength. He felt the shift in his world like a pressure change, subtle but unmistakable. He had given warmth, he had not yet given promise, but winter had a way of demanding more than you intended to offer. The storm arrived before dawn, not with drama, but with authority. Snow thickened in the night until the world outside the ranch house disappeared into a white silence that pressed against the windows and roof alike. The wind rose and fell in long breaths, piling drifts against the door, sealing the mountain in its grip. Morning came without color, the light pale and diffused, as if even the sun had agreed to keep its distance. Elias woke early, the habit carved into him deeper than comfort. He dressed by the dim glow of the stove, movements practiced, economical. When he stepped into the main room, he found Mara already awake, seated at the table with her coat folded neatly beside her. She looked smaller in the early light, fatigue etched more clearly now that the adrenaline of arrival had faded. Her auburn hair was braided loosely over one shoulder, strands escaping around her temples. She held a cup of coffee between her hands, staring into it without drinking, as if bracing herself for what daylight might demand. They acknowledged each other with a nod, nothing more. Outside, the wind answered for them. Elias went first to check the animals. Ash stood steady in the corral, snow frosting his mane, breath slow and patient. Bramble followed Elias through the drifts, moving carefully, his stiff joints protesting, but his loyalty uncompromised. The cattle huddled near the windbreak, backs dusted white. Everything alive had learned the same lesson on this mountain. You did not fight winter head-on, you endured it together. By the time Elias returned to the house, snow had swallowed the tracks from the sleigh entirely. There would be no traveling down to town today. Mara stood by the window now, watching the storm with an expression that was neither fear nor hope, but calculation. "The pass will be closed for days," she said quietly. Elias nodded. "At least." Silence settled again, heavier this time because it carried a decision neither of them could avoid much. It was Mara who broke it. "I won't pretend this isn't asking too much," she said. She turned to face him fully, shoulders squared, chin lifted. "But the children don't have days. The law won't wait for the weather." Elias leaned against the counter, arms folded, eyes steady. "Marriage done in a hurry doesn't usually age well," he replied. "Neither does waiting while others decide your life for you," Mara said. Her voice did not waver, but there was something raw beneath it now, a thin crack where fear lived. "I don't need affection. I don't need promises you can't keep. I need a name beside mine on a paper. I need time." Elias studied her in silence. He saw resolve, yes, but also restraint, the kind learned by people who had spent years putting others first. He thought of Owen again, of the way his brother had stepped into danger believing the mountain would show mercy if asked politely. "If we do this," Elias said at last, "it will be done clean." Mara nodded immediately. "Of course. We go to the church once the storm eases enough for Sutter to climb back up," he continued. "We sign what needs signing. No celebration, no pretending it's something it isn't." "I understand." "You'll stay here until spring at least," he added. "Town will talk." "They already do," Mara said, almost smiling. Elias exhaled slowly. The decision settled over him, not like relief, but like acceptance. He had not invited this, but neither would he step aside while others were crushed by indifference. "Then we do it," he said. Mara closed her eyes briefly, as if offering silent thanks to something she didn't dare name, then opened them again. "Thank you," she said. Elias shook his head. "Save it. Ink first." Reverend Sutter arrived the following afternoon, pushing through waist-deep snow on foot after leaving the sleigh below the ridge. His beard was rimmed with ice, cheeks flushed red, from cold, but his eyes were clear. "You're certain," he said, once Elias explained. It was not a question. "As certain as winter," Elias replied. The ceremony took place in the small church attached to the parsonage, a simple room with bare wooden walls, a plain cross at the front, and benches worn smooth by years of use. The fire burned low. There were no flowers, no witnesses beyond the reverend and the cold itself pressing against the walls. Mara stood straight in her dark coat, hands clasped tightly before her, face pale but composed. Elias stood beside her, hat removed, stubble shadowing his jaw, eyes fixed on the floorboards. When the reverend asked the questions, they answered without embellishment. Yes, yes. Their names were written carefully in the registry, ink dark against yellowed paper. Elias signed first, his handwriting spare and precise. Mara followed, her hand steady despite the weight of the moment. The reverend offered a prayer that asked not for happiness, but for endurance. "Amen," they said together, voices overlapping slightly, then fell silent. It was done. Outside, the storm continued, unimpressed. On the walk back to the ranch, neither spoke. Snow creaked beneath their boots, wind tugged at their coats. Ash whickered softly when they returned, as if acknowledging a change he did not need explained. Inside the house, the space felt altered, though nothing had moved. Two people now carried the same name, bound by necessity rather than affection. Mara removed her coat and hung it beside Elias's. The gesture was small, practical, and somehow heavier than words. "I'll sleep in the spare room," she said. Elias nodded. Of course. That night, The wind howled hard enough to shake the walls. Elias lay awake listening to it, aware of another presence under his roof, another life tied to his by ink and law. He felt no triumph, no romance, only the steady, uncomfortable knowledge that the mountain had shifted. Again, and he was standing on new ground, whether he liked it or not. Winter settled into the ranch like a long-held grudge. Days blurred into one another beneath a sky that rarely changed, the light thin and pale, the cold precise and unrelenting. Snow pressed against the walls and roof until the house felt smaller, more deliberate, as if it had decided to keep only what was necessary. Inside, two people learned the geography of shared space without a map. Elias rose before dawn as he always had, boots pulled on by memory, coat shrugged into place by instinct. Mara woke later, not from indulgence, but from a different rhythm shaped by years of tending children rather than livestock. They crossed paths in the kitchen in quiet, efficient ways, speaking only when needed, their words careful and practical. Coffee was poured, bread sliced, tasks assigned without ceremony. The marriage existed as a fact, not a feeling, present in the way coats hung side by side on the wall, and in the ledger where Elias wrote expenses now marked with 2 initials instead of 1. Outside, the mountain tested them daily. Elias hauled wood until his shoulders burned, repaired fences half buried by drifts, and checked the cattle along paths packed hard by repeated passage. Ash remained his constant, the old horse moving with the patience of someone who had learned that haste wasted warmth. Bramble followed at a distance, his stiff gait more pronounced in the cold, but his presence unwavering. Mara took to the interior work first, scrubbing floors, mending torn shirts, learning the temperamental stove that demanded respect more than force. Her hands grew rough quickly, skin cracking despite salve, but she did not complain. In the afternoons, she began to teach, setting out slates and chalk on the table, reading aloud from worn books she had carried in her satchel. At first, Elias listened only in passing, the sound of her voice drifting through the house like a remembered tune. Then, gradually, he found himself pausing, lingering near the doorway, hearing, not just words but patience, the steady cadence of someone accustomed to making sense of chaos for small minds. Town remained distant, physically and socially. When the pass opened briefly between storms, Elias rode down alone for supplies, returning with flour, beans, lamp oil, and the inevitable looks. Some were curious, some disapproving, some simply measuring. The bartender asked no questions. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow and rang up the order. News traveled faster than weather, and by the time Elias returned up the ridge, the story had already found its shape. The mountain man had taken a wife, and no one knew why. The why didn't matter. What mattered was that Winter had 2 bodies now instead of 1, and that made people uneasy. Inside the ranch house, unease took quieter forms. Mara learned quickly where not to tread. She did not enter the small room off the back hall where Elias kept his brother's things, and Elias did not ask about the children unless she offered. They shared meals at the table without ceremony, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging observations about weather or supplies. Once, when a storm cut power to the lantern and darkness rushed in, Mara laughed softly in surprise, a sound so unguarded that Elias froze, then smiled despite himself before he could stop it. It did not happen again for a while. The mountain tested them in subtler ways too. One night, the wind rose sharply, rattling the eaves and driving snow through a gap in the window frame. Elias set to work sealing it with rags and pitch while Mara held the lantern steady, her breath fogging the glass. Their hands brushed once, briefly, the contact small but startling in its ordinariness. Neither commented. Another afternoon, Mara slipped on ice near the well and fell hard, breath knocked from her chest. Elias reached her in seconds, lifting her with careful strength, his jaw set, eyes scanning for injury. She waved him off once she could breathe again, embarrassed. More than hurt, and he set her down gently, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back. It was not romance that grew between them in those weeks. It was familiarity, the kind earned by shared labor and shared silence. The ranch learned them both. Mara learned the sound of Elias's steps on the porch and could tell by the weight of them whether the day had gone well. Elias learned the way Mara's shoulders tightened when she worried about the children, and the way she counted under her breath when anxious, a habit left over from classrooms and bedtime routines. He also learned that she prayed quietly at night, not loudly or with performance, but with the focused humility of someone who believed effort mattered, but grace did too. New faces did not appear often, but winter brought one that mattered. On a rare, clear day, as Elias repaired a gate, a boy appeared at the edge of the property, thin as a fence post and bundled in a coat too large for him. He stood uncertainly, boots soaked, cheeks red from cold, eyes darting between Elias and the house. He was perhaps 10 or 11, hair the color of straw cut unevenly, skin pale beneath a smudge of dirt. When Elias approached, the boy stiffened, chin lifting in defiance learned too early. "I'm not stealing," he said, voice thin but determined. Elias crouched to his level, careful not to crowd him. "Then you won't mind telling me why you're here?" The boy hesitated, then blurted the truth. He had run from town after hearing he would be sent east, separated from his sister. He knew where the mountain man lived because people talked, and because his teacher, Mara, had once told them that some places were safer than they looked. Elias felt the weight of that sentence settle in his chest. Mara appeared in the doorway then, having seen the shapes in the snow. Her face changed instantly, concern overtaking surprise. She moved toward the boy, lowering herself to his height, voice gentle but firm. She didn't touch him until he nodded permission, and when she did, it was with the practiced reassurance of someone who had guided many small fears back into place. They brought him inside, fed him soup, dried his socks by the stove. He ate quickly, glancing up often as if expecting the world to change its mind. Elias listened as Mara asked careful questions, piecing together a story of bureaucratic decisions and frightened children. When the boy finally slept on a pallet near the stove, Elias stepped outside with Mara, the cold biting hard. "You can't keep him," Elias said quietly. "I know," Mara replied, "but I can make sure he's not lost in the system." Elias studied the snow-packed yard, the dark line of trees beyond. "People will say we planned this," he said. "People say things," Mara answered. "Children still need help." The boy left 2 days later, escorted safely back to town by the Reverend once the weather allowed. The house felt emptier for his absence, the quiet heavier. That night, Elias found Mara at the table, writing letters by lamplight, her brow furrowed, jaw set. He poured her coffee without asking and set it beside her. She looked up, surprised, then smiled, a small, tired smile that felt like an earned truce. Winter did not ease, but the house learned warmth that was not just from fire. Two strangers had become something else, not yet partners in name or heart, but in endurance. The marriage remained ink on paper. The life beneath it was beginning to take shape. The mountain chose its moment without asking permission. Winter had loosened its grip just enough to become dangerous, the kind of thaw that fooled men into thinking the worst had passed while the upper slopes remained loaded and tense. The sky that morning was a washed-out blue, brittle and bright, the sun throwing a deceptive warmth across the ridge. Elias noticed the signs before most would have, the way the snow crust sang under his boots, the hollow sound when his weight crossed certain patches, the uneasy restlessness in Ash's ears as they moved along the upper fence line. Experience had taught him that danger did not announce itself loudly. It whispered, and only those who had learned to listen survived. He had planned to ride the boundary and check the far pasture where wind piled drifts high against the tree line. It was routine, necessary, and in his mind, manageable. Mara stood on the porch as he saddled Ash, her coat pulled tight, hair tucked beneath a wool cap. She watched him with the same quiet attention she gave everything that mattered. "You'll be back by dark," she said, not as a question, but as a request shaped like one. Elias tightened the cinch and nodded. "I won't be long." Bramble circled the yard, tail low, uneasy. He whined once, a sound he rarely made. Elias crouched and scratched the dog's head, fingers lingering in the thick fur. "Mind the house," he murmured. Bramble leaned into the touch as if trying to memorize it. The ride up was uneventful at first, Ash placing his hooves carefully, breath steady. Elias moved with him, reading the slope, keeping distance from the steeper cuts where snow liked to break free. He had done this 100 times. He had survived worse. And yet, as he dismounted near the upper gate to inspect a sagging post, the mountain shifted. It was not the thunderous roar people imagined when they spoke of avalanches. It was a deep, rolling crack, like a massive exhale from the earth itself. Elias turned just in time to see the slab above him fracture, the snow shearing loose in a white curtain that swallowed sound and scale. Ash reared, eyes wide, but Elias was already moving, cutting the reins and diving downslope toward the trees. The force knocked him off his feet, drove air from his lungs, spun him hard against the ground. Snow poured over him, heavy and suffocating, filling his mouth, his collar, his thoughts. He fought, instinct screaming louder than pain, clawing for space, for breath, for direction. Then everything went still, the world reduced to pressure and dark. Time lost meaning. Down at the ranch, Mara felt it before she saw it. The sound reached her as a dull tremor through the ground, a vibration that rattled the cups on the shelf and set Bramble barking in sharp, panicked bursts. She stepped onto the porch, eyes scanning the slope, heart hammering. The mountain looked unchanged, serene in its deception. But she knew. She had learned to read Elias's silences. Now she learned the mountains. "Elias," she whispered, the name torn from her before she realized she had spoken it. She did not wait for certainty. She pulled on her coat, grabbed the rope and shovel kept by the door, and whistled sharply. Bramble was at her side instantly, hackles raised, urgency in every step. She mounted the spare horse, a younger mare named Willow, chestnut with a white blaze and more spirit than sense, and urged her toward the upper path, praying the animal would listen better than fear. The climb was brutal. Snow sucked at Willow's legs. Wind bit at Mara's cheeks until tears froze at the corners of her eyes. Bramble bounded ahead and back, nose low, barking whenever he caught a scent. Halfway up, they found Ash standing alone near the tree line, sides heaving, one flank streaked with snow and dirt. His reins lay broken at his feet. Mara's heart lurched. She dismounted, grabbing his bridle, pressing her forehead briefly against his. "Neck, where is he?" she asked the horse, absurd and desperate. Ash snorted and tossed his head toward the slope. Mara followed the line of disturbance, a smooth, unnatural plain of packed snow where the mountain had slid. She dismounted and began to dig, using the shovel until her arms burned, then her hands when the shovel caught on ice. Bramble scratched frantically, barking, nose buried, digging with a focus that bordered on fury. Minutes stretched. Her breath came in harsh gasps. Then her hand struck something solid that was not stone. She dug faster, fingers numb, skin torn. She uncovered a sleeve, a shoulder, a face blue-lipped but breathing. "Elias," she said, voice breaking, and kept digging until she could pull him free. He coughed violently, lungs burning, eyes fluttering open. Confusion flickered, then recognition. He tried to speak and failed. Mara wrapped him in her coat, pressed her face to his and spoke steadily, the way she did with frightened children. "Stay with me," she said. "You're not alone." With Ash and Willow, with rope and stubborn will, she got him down the mountain inch by inch. By the time they reached the ranch, dusk had fallen and the temperature dropped hard. Elias drifted in and out, shock setting in. Mara stripped his wet clothes, warmed him by the stove, pressed heated stones wrapped in cloth against his sides, following instructions she had learned long ago and hoped she'd never need. Bramble lay at Elias's feet, head on his boots, refusing to move. Elias woke fully near midnight, pain blooming through his chest and shoulder, head pounding. He found Mara seated beside the bed, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion, hair loose, hands steady despite the tremor running through her. For a moment, he could not speak past the lump in his throat. "You shouldn't have come," he said finally, voice hoarse. Mara met his gaze without flinching. "You didn't give me that choice." He tried to sit and winced. She pressed him gently back. "Don't." Silence stretched, filled by the stove's soft crackle and the wind's renewed assault outside. Elias swallowed. "Owen," he said suddenly. "He died up there." The words came out raw, unfiltered. He had not spoken them aloud in years. Mara listened, not interrupting, her presence an anchor. He told her about the day, the argument, the wait that turned into a search that turned into spring. He told her about guilt that lived like a second spine in his back. When he finished, his eyes were wet and unashamed. Mara reached out and took his hand, her grip firm, warm. "You didn't kill him," she said softly. "The mountain doesn't bargain. It only asks who will keep living." Elias closed his eyes, the truth landing where defenses had thinned. Over the next days he healed slowly. Bruises bloomed, pain lingered, but life returned. Word reached town of the slide and the rescue. Some shook their heads, some whispered that the Penpokanka, Mountain Man's wife, had saved him. A few brought supplies up the ridge without comment. Mara wrote letters at the table, advocating harder now, armed with proof of commitment no one could deny. One afternoon, a man arrived unannounced. Calvin Rourke, a representative of a logging syndicate, tall and thick-necked, beard trimmed sharp, eyes calculating. He spoke smoothly of opportunity, of land changing hands, of inevitability. Elias listened from the doorway, arm in a sling, expression flat. Mara stood beside him. "No," she said, and closed the door. That night, Elias sat on the porch with a blanket around his shoulders, watching the stars sharpen in the cold. Mara joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. Their shoulders touched, neither pulling away. "I didn't agree to this to be brave," she said quietly. "I agreed because it mattered." Elias nodded. "So did you." The mountain loomed dark and vast. Its demand made it answered. The choice had been taken from them. In the slide and returned in the aftermath, they had chosen each other, not in ink, but in action. Spring did not arrive in Silver Creek the way stories promised. It crept in reluctantly, tugging winter back inch by inch, leaving the ground soaked and unstable, the kind of season that rewarded patience and punished greed. Snow melted unevenly across the slopes, revealing dark earth beneath in jagged patches, while the creek ran swollen and loud, carrying ice fragments like reminders that cold never truly forgot. Elias moved slower now. His shoulder healed well enough for work, but not without consequence. The ache lingered deep in the joint, a dull reminder of how quickly the mountain could decide otherwise. He wore the sling less each day, though Mara noticed the way he favored one side when lifting, and how his jaw tightened when pain surprised him. He did not complain. He never had. The ranch resumed its rhythm cautiously. Fences damaged by winter were reset, posts straightened, gates rehung. Ash worked steadily, old strength still reliable, his gray coat shedding in rough clumps. Willow paced more restlessly, energy sharpened by spring, tossing her head whenever Elias took the reins. Bramble followed them all, slower now but determined, his cloudy eye turned always toward whoever needed watching. Mara divided her days between the ranch and town. She rode down whenever the pass allowed, returning with supplies and news that Elias pretended not to care about, but always listened to. The orphan home was under increased scrutiny, she said. County officials asked questions framed as concern. Men Elias did not know lingered near the property lines in town, measuring, marking. The name Calvin Rourke surfaced again and again, spoken quietly with distaste. Elias listened from the porch one evening as Mara recounted a meeting at the general store. "They're offering to relieve the county of responsibility," she said. "Storage for logging equipment, temporary use, they claim." Elias snorted. Temporary always forgets to leave. The pressure grew subtle and constant. Notices arrived at the orphan home questioning compliance, demanding inventories, audits, timelines. On the ranch, a survey stake appeared near the eastern boundary, driven into the mud where no one had permission to place it. Elias pulled it out and tossed it aside, jaw tight. He did not need paper to know where his land ended. The men who did not respect that fact were not interested in negotiation. They arrived 3 days later, riding up the pass in a small group, horses well-fed, coats clean despite the mud. Calvin Rourke rode at the front, tall and thick through the shoulders, beard trimmed into sharp lines that suggested discipline rather than comfort. His hair was dark, streaked prematurely with gray at the temples, and his eyes were pale and assessing, missing nothing while revealing even less. He dismounted with practiced ease, boots barely sinking into the softened ground. 2 others followed him, hired men by the look of them, younger, broader, less careful with their movements. Elias stepped out onto the porch to meet them, posture straight, face impassive. Mara stood just behind him, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, the other holding her coat closed against the chill. Bramble positioned himself at Elias's side, a low warning rumble in his chest. "Mr. Calder," Rourke called, voice smooth, almost pleasant. "We didn't finish our conversation." "You finished it," Elias replied evenly. "You just didn't like the answer." Rourke smiled thinly. "You misunderstand me. This isn't about liking, it's about inevitability." He gestured broadly toward the valley. "Logging is coming. Storage is needed. The county prefers efficiency." "The county doesn't own this land," Elias said, "nor the orphan home." "Not yet," Rourke answered, Mara stepped forward then, chin lifted, eyes steady. "The trust remains valid," she said. "You know that." Rourke's gaze flicked to her, sharpening. "Trusts can be challenged," he said, "especially when marriages are unusual." The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Elias felt the old heat rise, the kind that had once driven him into storms without thinking. He kept his voice level with effort. "You're done here." Rourke's smile widened, but his eyes cooled. "We'll see." He mounted his horse and turned away without another word, his men following. The visit left the air thick and unsettled. That night, Mara sat at the table long after supper, papers spread before her, writing by lamplight. Elias watched her from across the room, the lines of her face drawn with fatigue and determination. "They'll come for you next," he said quietly. Mara did not look up. "They already have." 2 days later, the sheriff rode up unannounced. Sheriff Amos Hargreave was a man in his early 40s, broad-faced, with a mustache worn thick and drooping, eyes set deep beneath a brow furrowed by responsibility, rather than cruelty. He removed his hat respectfully when Elias met him at the gate. "Afternoon," he said. "Got a complaint." Elias crossed his arms. "From who?" "From men who like to file paperwork," Hargreave replied with a sigh. "They claim boundary interference, trespass." Elias laughed once, humorless. "They put a stake on my land." "I know," the sheriff said. "I pulled it myself." He lowered his voice. "But they're pushing, hard. County's feeling it." Mara joined them, face composed. "We have documentation," she said. Hargreave nodded. "Bring it to town, sooner rather than later." He glanced at Elias's shoulder. "Heard about the slide. Glad you're still breathing." Elias inclined his head. "So am I." After the sheriff left, the ranch felt watched. Small things went wrong. A gate left open, feed sacks torn, once a fence cut clean through in the night. Elias repaired each without comment, though his silence grew heavier. Mara noticed the way he checked the windows before bed now, the way he slept lighter. One afternoon, returning from town, Mara found Elias standing in the barn doorway, staring at Ash. The old horse stood favoring one leg, a shallow cut visible above the hoof, fresh. "Wire," Elias said, voice flat. "Not from here." Mara felt a cold settle in her chest. "They're not waiting," she said. Elias closed his eyes briefly. "No." That evening, as the sky darkened, a knock came at the door. A young woman stood outside, breathless, cheeks flushed from the climb. She was slight, early 20s, dark hair pulled back tightly, eyes wide with urgency. "My name is Lila Grant," she said quickly. "I work at the county office." Elias studied her. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I know," Lila replied, "but I saw the filings. They're pushing for an emergency review. They want to declare the orphan home mismanaged." Mara stepped closer. "On what grounds?" Lila swallowed. "On paper, numbers twisted, deadlines moved." She glanced nervously back down the trail. "Rourke paid my supervisor to fast-track it." Silence fell. Elias opened the door wider. "Come in." Lila hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, shaking. Over coffee, she explained how she'd lost her own parents young, how the orphan home had fed her when nothing else would. "I can't fix it alone," she said, voice breaking. "But I couldn't stay quiet." Elias listened, anger burning cold and steady now. This was no longer about property lines or pride. It was about predation dressed as progress. When Lila left under cover of dusk, Elias and Mara sat together, the weight of what lay ahead settling in. "They think winter weakens people," Mara said softly. Elias looked at the darkening mountain, then back at her. "They forget what winter teaches." He reached for her hand, not tentative now, but sure. "We don't stand alone anymore." Outside, the cold lingered, patient as ever. Inside, resolve hardened. The people who profited from the cold had chosen their ground. Elias and Mara would meet them there. The thaw changed the town before it changed the mountain. Silver Creek woke one morning to streets thick with mud instead of snow, boots sticking where they once slid, horses blowing harder as they pulled wagons through ruts that refused to hold their shape. Winter loosened its grip just enough to reveal what had been pressed beneath it. Old resentments, quiet loyalties, and the kind of fear that came from knowing something valuable was about to be taken if no one spoke fast enough. Word spread that the county would hold a public review at the meeting hall by the creek, an emergency session meant to clarify management concerns about the orphan home and surrounding lands. Everyone knew what that meant. When systems wanted to take, they called it clarification. Elias rode down early, Ash moving with a measured patience that mirrored his rider's mood. His shoulder still ached in the cold shadows, but the pain felt distant now, secondary to the steady resolve tightening in his chest. Mara rode beside him on Willow, posture straight, jaw set, papers wrapped in oilcloth and secured against her body. Bramble followed on foot as far as the ridge allowed, then stopped, watching them go with a low whine before turning back toward the ranch. He understood boundaries. He always had. The meeting hall stood near the creek, a long wooden building with a potbelly stove at its center and benches arranged without ceremony. Men and women filtered in quietly, coats damp, faces wary. Some nodded to Elias, others looked away. A few offered tight smiles to Mara, the kind that held more hope than certainty. Sheriff Amos Hargreaves stood near the front, hat in hand, mustache damp, eyes scanning the room with a practiced neutrality that hid fatigue. At a table set slightly apart sat Calvin Rourke, clean and composed, flanked by a pair of associates whose suits fit too well for a town that measured wealth in winter survival. Rourke's beard was trimmed sharp as ever, his pale eyes bright with confidence. He greeted arrivals with a courteous nod that never reached his gaze. When the meeting was called to order, Rourke spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He talked about efficiency, about resources strained by charity, about progress arriving whether people welcomed it or not. He framed the orphan home as a noble effort that had outgrown its means, and the mountain ranch as an underutilized asset standing in the way of opportunity. He spoke of deadlines missed and records incomplete, his words sliding easily into the cracks created by scarcity and fear. Murmurs rippled through the benches. Elias watched faces change, watched doubt bloom where certainty had once lived. This was how men like Rourke worked, by making the taking sound like rescue. Mara stood when it was her turn, smoothing the front of her coat with a deliberate calm. She did not rush. She did not interrupt. She let the room settle. When she spoke, her voice carried without force, shaped by years of teaching rooms full of restless children. She spoke of names before numbers. She spoke of routines, meals cooked, lessons taught, injuries tended. She laid out the trust documents plainly, explaining the clause that demanded marriage not as a weakness, but as an outdated belief she had navigated honestly. She named the audits and showed receipts, the inventories and schedules. The room grew quieter as she worked, the way it did when people recognized competence presented without apology. Rourke leaned back, fingers steepled. "Paper can be arranged," he said mildly. "Intent is harder to prove." He glanced toward Elias, "especially when arrangements are unusual." Elias stood then, slowly, his presence changing the air. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at the floor once, then lifted his gaze and met Rourke's without flinching. "Unusual is surviving up a mountain when everyone tells you to leave," he said. His voice was steady, unadorned. "Unusual is taking in children no one else wants to count. What's not unusual is men trying to profit from that." A few heads nodded. Sheriff Hargreaves shifted his weight. From the back of the room, a chair scraped. Lila Grant stood, hands trembling but chin lifted. She looked smaller here, surrounded by neighbors and authority, but there was steel in her posture that had not been there when she first climbed the ridge. "I work at the county office," she said, voice clear. "I saw the filings. I saw the deadlines moved and the numbers changed." A hush fell. Rourke's smile faltered just barely. Lila continued, eyes fixed ahead. "I saw payments made to supervisors to expedite a review that hadn't been requested by the trust." She swallowed, then went on. "That's not clarification. That's manipulation." A stir ran through the room, sharper now. Sheriff Hargreaves stepped forward. "Ms. Grant," he said carefully, "are you prepared to stand by that statement?" "I am," Lila replied. "I've prepared copies." She handed a packet to the sheriff, who flipped through it with a deepening frown. Rourke rose, irritation breaking through polish. "This is absurd," he said. "Allegations from a junior clerk." "With evidence," Hargreaves cut in. He turned to the room. "I'll need to confer with the county judge." The words landed like a dropped tool, heavy, decisive. Rourke opened his mouth to argue and closed it again when he saw the shift in the benches. People were leaning forward now, not back. The tide had turned, not fully, but enough to make standing alone uncomfortable. Elias felt Mara's hand find his, steady and warm. He squeezed once, not looking at her, knowing she would understand. Outside, the creek ran loud and brown, carrying winter's last resistance downstream. The meeting adjourned with no resolution announced, but the promise of review hung in the air like a storm that would finally break. As people filed out, a man Elias hadn't seen in years approached. He was tall and spare, beard unkempt, eyes deep set with a familiar sorrow. Thomas Pike, once a rancher along the lower pass, removed his hat and nodded. "You spoke well," he said. His voice carried the weight of someone who had lost land to paperwork. "Wish I had someone stand like that for me." Elias inclined his head. "You stand when you can," he replied. Pike's mouth twitched in something like gratitude before he moved on. The days that followed were thick with waiting. Papers traveled, whispers grew bolder. Rourke did not return to the ranch, but his absence felt less threatening now than his presence had. Elias repaired the last of the winter damage, muscles remembering work that did not require watching the horizon for riders. Mara returned to town daily, guiding Lila through affidavits and timelines, careful to keep the girl from burning out under the strain. At night, they spoke more, freely, not about strategy but about what came after: repairs at the orphan home, fencing the east boundary properly, moving cattle to the lower pasture when the ground firmed. One evening, as the light stretched long and thin across the valley, Elias found Mara at the edge of the creek watching the water carry away ice. "It's strange," she said, "how quickly things can change when people stop being quiet." Elias nodded. "Silence has its place," he said. "So does speaking." He paused. "You did good." She smiled, tired but genuine. "We did." A rider came at dusk, splashing through the shallows. Sheriff Hargreave dismounted, face set with relief he did not try to hide. "County judge ordered a halt," he said. "Review suspended pending investigation." He looked at Mara. "Your home stays yours, for now." He turned to Elias. "So does your land." The words settled like warmth after cold. Mara exhaled slowly, eyes bright. Elias felt something ease. Inside him, a knot loosening he hadn't realized was tied so tight. As the sheriff rode away, the mountain watched, impassive as ever. Winter had taught them endurance. Spring taught them that truth, once uncovered, had a way of finding light. The choice the mountain had demanded had been answered not with force, but with standing together. The thaw revealed more than ground. It revealed who would stay when pressure came, and who would be seen for what they were. Spring arrived the way it always did in Silver Creek, without ceremony and without waiting for anyone to feel ready. The snow did not vanish overnight. It retreated in stages, revealing the land beneath in uneven truths. Hillsides turned slick and dark, fences emerged bent but standing, and the creek ran fast with meltwater, loud enough to drown out old arguments if you let it. The mountain watched from above, indifferent to resolutions signed in town halls, yet quietly satisfied when people chose to keep living. At the ranch, mornings changed first. Light came earlier, sharper, warming the porch boards just enough to invite bare hands. Elias noticed it in the way his breath no longer burned when he stepped outside, in the way Ash's coat shed fully and shone darker beneath. The old horse moved easier now, his stiff leg loosening with each mild day. Bramble followed Elias out each morning and lay in the sun by the door, eyes half closed, chest rising slow and steady. He was older than winter stories liked to admit, but he had learned where warmth gathered and stayed there without apology. Mara's days stretched wider. With the county review halted and the investigation underway, she returned to the orphan home openly, no longer slipping in under the weight of rumor. The children greeted her as if she had never left, clinging to her skirt, showing her the places where winter had cracked walls and patience alike. She organized repairs with a practiced calm, writing lists, assigning tasks, thanking everyone twice. Elias rode down with her on market days, bringing lumber and tools, staying to mend what needed mending. He did not linger in rooms full of talk, but he worked until his shoulders ached, and the children learned his name without being told. The town shifted, slowly. People who had watched from a distance now nodded openly. Supplies arrived without notes attached. One afternoon, Thomas Pike showed up at the ranch with a wagon of posts and wire, his gut. Beard still wild, his eyes steadier than before. "Figured you could use these," he said, setting the brake. Elias shook his hand once, firm. "Much obliged." Pike hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't leave." Elias watched him go, the wagon rattling down the pass, and felt something like the past finally loosening its grip. The final word came on a bright morning when the air smelled of wet earth and pine sap. Sheriff Amos Hargreave rode up the trail and dismounted with a stiffness that suggested relief more than fatigue. He removed his hat, ran a hand through thinning hair, and met them both with a tired smile. "Judge ruled," he said. "The trust stands. The filings were tampered with. Mr. Rourke won't be making offers around here for a while." He paused, then added quietly, "Charges are being considered." Mara closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, the tension easing from her shoulders in a way that words could not have achieved. Elias nodded once. "Thank you." The sheriff inclined his head and turned back toward town, leaving quiet in his wake. Life did not become easy after that. It became honest. There were fences to finish and roofs to patch, budgets to balance, children to place and keep. Elias learned the shape of Mara's resolve not in speeches, but in the way she stood between a frightened child and a raised voice, in the way she laughed softly when a plan went wrong and tried again without complaint. Mara learned the depth of Elias's care in the way he fixed things before they broke, in the way he checked the creek after heavy rains and the pasture after long days, in the way he sat with children who missed home and said little, knowing presence mattered more than answers. One evening, as the valley filled with gold and the creek quieted to a steady murmur, Elias found Mara on the porch steps reading a letter. Her brow was furrowed, but when she looked up, there was something like peace in her eyes. "It's from Helena," she said. "They're offering funding for the home, long term." Elias sat beside her, careful of his shoulder, and listened as she explained the terms. When she finished, he nodded. "Sounds right." She smiled. "It does." They didn't speak of the marriage often. It existed as a shared fact, neither burden nor banner. But one night, when the stars came out sharp and close, Elias broke the habit of silence. They sat on the porch, with coffee gone cold between them, Bramble's head resting on Mara's boot, Ash grazing quietly beyond the fence. "We did this because we had to," Elias said, eyes on the dark outline of the trees. "If you want out, now that you can, I won't stand in the way." The words cost him more than he expected. Mara did not answer immediately. She looked at the land, at the house, at the mountain that had taken and tested and finally allowed. "I don't want out," she said at last. "I want in." Elias turned to her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. She met his gaze without flinching. "Not because of papers. Because this is where my work belongs, and—" She hesitated, then continued, "because this is where I do too." Elias felt the truth settle, not like a rush, but like a foundation finding bedrock. They decided without fanfare. No announcements, no invitations sent far and wide. The Reverend was asked to return on a Sunday when the weather held, and the neighbors came because they wanted to, not because anyone told them to. The ceremony took place behind the orphan home, where the grass grew uneven and wildflowers pushed through wherever they could. The children gathered close, solemn and curious, their faces bright with anticipation. Elias stood in a clean shirt and his best coat, stubble-trimmed, posture steady. Mara wore a simple dress, her hair braided back, face lit with something that needed no name. The Reverend spoke briefly, asking not for perfection, but for patience and courage. Elias and Mara spoke their vows plainly, promises shaped by work rather than poetry. When they finished, the children cheered and someone laughed, and the sound felt right. That night, back at the ranch, they sat again on the porch, the same stars overhead, the same mountain keeping watch. Bramble slept between them, content, his breathing slow. Ash stood near the fence, head low, ears relaxed. Elias reached for Mara's hand without thinking. She took it, fingers warm, grip sure. They did not speak. They did not need to. Spring had not asked permission to arrive. It had simply come, carrying with it the proof that endurance could turn into something gentler if given time. The mountain had demanded a choice. They had answered. And the land at last rested easy. Sometimes God does not change the storm. Sometimes He changes the people who choose to stand in it. This story reminds us that miracles are not always loud or sudden. Often they arrive quietly, through a door open to a stranger, through hands that refuse to let go, through courage found in ordinary days. When Elias and Mara chose responsibility over fear, they didn't ask God to make life easy. They asked for strength to do what was right. And in return, God met them there, on frozen ground, in tired hearts, in moments when giving up would have been simpler. In our own lives, we may never face a mountain of snow or men trying to take our home, but we all face seasons where hope feels thin, where love asks more than we think we can give. This is where faith lives, not in perfection, but in perseverance, not in grand gestures, but in quiet obedience. God's grace often moves at the pace of trust, not urgency. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may be walking through a difficult season today. Let them know they are not forgotten. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what quiet miracle you are still praying for. And if you believe, as we do, that no child or animal should ever face fear alone, subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, compassion, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps today, tomorrow, and always.